Skip it. Yep.
Attention, everybody. The views and opinions expressed on the show are not necessarily those of Acts Ministry, Acts Media Group, and or their affiliate and subordinate ministries and or nonprofits. So here he is back again today to talk about all the things that interest most of us. Dr. Steve Albrecht, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Welcome to Crime Time. This is Crime Time podcast episode 48. I'm Dr. Steve Albrecht, and I'm joining you from the Acts Media Group studios in Springfield, Missouri. For this hour, I'll be talking about issues related to domestic violence, both when it happens at home and when it crosses over to the workplace. So it is a concern for us as a social issue, especially in the workplace. We'll talk about what you need to do if you're a supervisor or a boss, or if you're an employee. It's a complex issue. It's a frightening issue. There's a phrase that these perpetrators use, which is, if I can't have you, nobody else can. Those guys are wicked dangerous. We'll talk about how you can understand it better if it's happening to you or somebody that you care about. So thanks for listening to Crime Time, where we talk about crime and crooks and cops and personal security. We'll talk about some dangerous people and lots of heroes. We'll even mention a few stupid crooks. And most importantly, I'll talk to you about what you can do to keep yourself and your family safe from crime and violence. As always, you need to be vigilant at home and in your neighborhood and in your community and at school and at work and even on the road. This show exists to make you feel more empowered, more secure, and more educated on security issues and the criminal justice system. As background, I worked for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years. I now work as a training consultant, and I teach training workshops focusing on human resources and employee coaching, workplace violence, and security issues in the workplace. I've written 23 books on business, workplace violence, police subjects, and guns, all of which you can find on Amazon, and my 3 gun books are available on Amazon Kindle: Albrecht on Guns, Albrecht and Farrow on Guns. That's my partner, Mike Farrow, Farrow, and Albrecht on Guns, Volume 3. You can always reach me at my Crime Time website, crimetimeradio.com. You can send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm there, Dr. Steve Albrecht on LinkedIn. That's Albrecht, Albrecht. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. I'm a big Twitter guy. You can find past episodes of the show on SoundCloud and new ones on YouTube. So let's talk about domestic violence as an issue in our society and as a workplace concern as well. In my time with the police department, when I started in the 80s, I started in 84, there was an approach to the police response to domestic violence, which is cops would show up at a DV victim's house. There'd be an angry and upset woman and an angry and upset guy. And we'd say, okay, you go to your sister's house, or your mother's house to the woman, or we'd say to the guy, you go to your brother's house, or you go sleep it off somewhere. And we wouldn't do very much. Sometimes we'd take a report, sometimes we wouldn't. Oftentimes the dynamics were really hostile and emotional. The victim was upset and wanted us to do something, and so sometimes a lot of cops said, well, let's just separate the parties and that'll solve the problem. As you can guess, back in the day, in the 80s, that led to a lot of domestic violence homicides. That led to a continuation of the problem. We never intervened in an effective way in law enforcement. We had no sense of how to get people into therapeutic or counseling environments, how to get them separated, how to get a counselor, a therapist involved in the discussion. No sense of sort of domestic violence victims' rights at that point in time. And so the 80s was really a bad time for domestic violence victims, lots of homicides. So, typical situation, the cops would leave. This person who was a domestic violence perpetrator would return with a gun or a knife and kill the victim, and we would say, gee, what can we do differently next time? Well, soon after that, as we got into the 90s, we were exposed to a model that came from Duluth, Minnesota, called the Duluth model, where it mandated, based on their research and how they did things differently than the other parts of the country, where we would mandate arrests. So we would arrest people for domestic violence. What a concept. Assault somebody that you live with or that you love or used to love or in a dating relationship or parents of a child, you'd go to jail. And that model, the Duluth model, became the national model in the United States for how we would respond to police issues connected to domestic violence. One of the things that we saw is a reduction in domestic violence cases because of the consequences connected to that response by the police. And the other thing we saw was that there was a shift in how we explain things to little kids in domestic violence situations. In the old days, we would say something stupid like, your dad's coming with us for just a little bit, but don't worry, he'll be back later, and we would send little Johnny off to bed, and hopefully he'd sort of figure out that, what dad did was wrong. We changed that model completely. What we said was, your dad hit your mom, and that's not right, and he's going to jail. And we would handcuff dad in front of little Johnny and say, your dad's going to jail because he hit your mother, and it's not what you're supposed to do to your mom, and he's going to jail. And that's what happens. And so we would do that for a simple reason, which is, how do we break the cycle in families, especially generational issues in families, that say there are consequences for this behavior and it needs to stop. And we will demonstrate to everybody in the house, children and others there, that there are and should be consequences for domestic violence. And if you hit your mom, you hit your spouse or partner, you hit the parent of a child, somebody you're living with or dating, there are consequences for that behavior. So the Duluth model led us in law enforcement to set up, which exists today, specific domestic violence units inside PDs that just investigated EV cases. So in 92 or 3, I think I recall, the police department in San Diego set up a domestic violence unit. And I went to work for that unit in 94, I think it was. And from 94 to 99, or 93, 93 to 99, I handled 1,500 cases in that time span. And that was working as an investigator part-time for them. So you can imagine how much the full-time investigators were doing in those situations. They handled way more cases than I did, and I handled 1,500. So what we figured out from the police response was we also needed a resource list for people who were struggling with domestic violence as perpetrators or as victims. So we created a resource list, and it was a county-wide collection of therapists and domestic violence advocacy groups and things connected to domestic violence prevention that we could give to victims of DV. We also put domestic violence perpetrators in jail, and even for the smallest thing, like a grab mark on the victim's arm. So if we saw visible injuries, that person went to jail. When you look at DV as a demographic breakdown, it's typically 85% male perpetrators, 15% female perpetrators. So women do domestic violence, there's no question about that, but it's much rare. We have same-sex sexual orientation domestic violence. Gay and lesbian relationships have DV in them, certainly true. So I'm going to focus on the male pronoun as a domestic violence perpetrator because that's the most common one. So people can say women hit men and things like that, and I agree, I've handled those cases. And we have same-sex sexual orientation, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to use the male pronoun. It's mostly male perpetrators that are doing these things to female victims. So when we look at domestic violence as a workplace issue, then a lot of other complexities come in. So you're a boss, you're a supervisor, you're a manager, you're running a company, your employee comes in, she's afraid, she has visible injuries, or she's startled or fearful, she's in tears, she's upset, she's usually very talkative and communicative, and this time she's not at all. You see substantial, significant, visible changes in her behavior, and you say, well, it's not my issue. It's a home privacy thing. I'm not supposed to pry into people's personal lives. Her relationship and her marriage or her dating relationship with whoever she happens to be with is none of my concern. And then I always say, well, okay, except when it affects the business. When it affects the business in a negative way, then as a supervisor, manager, business owner, you've got to do something about it. When we see these cases get to the worst case scenario, the perpetrator shows up at the office, shoots and kills the victim, shoots and kills other people. We've seen lots of cases around this country of murder-suicide connected to domestic violence. As I recall, last year we had a case in Chicago at a hospital where a woman was working as an emergency room physician, and her estranged boyfriend came in and shot and killed her, shot and killed some other people, and then killed himself. So I learned as a brand new investigator in the domestic violence unit that we take those threats, if I can't have you, nobody else can, quite seriously. And we respond to them in a different way than we used to. We try to put that guy in jail for even the consequences of his words, because we know in those situations when those people say it, and there's an emotionality connected to it, there's also a property issue, which we'll talk about, and it's not personal property, it's the person perceives the victim as his property, which makes it even more volatile. When you think about this idea, if I can't have you, nobody else can, these types of perpetrators see the victim as something that they own. There's a stalking component, there's a personal possession component based on their behavior, and it's quite volatile. And so when I do threat assessment cases, and oftentimes in workplace situations, one of the things I'll ask the victim, how do you know this person? And she'll say, I used to date him, or we're boyfriend and girlfriend, we recently split up, or we're husband and wife and we are having marital problems. Or they'll say, we're parents of a child together, or we live together. And I always ask the question, not to be in a prying way, but in a contextual way, and also trying to figure out the danger of this situation is, do you have a sexual relationship with this person, or did you have a sexual relationship with this person? And why that matters is that is one of the cut lines, one of the dividing lines of violence in these situations. So if a woman says to me, I just met the guy at Starbucks for a couple coffee dates. We went to the movies once, nothing ever happened, but he continues to bother me. He comes by the office or he calls me. I'm much less concerned about her safety and especially the threat of violence. So the previous sexual intimacy between the victim and the suspect really raised the stakes for violence against this person. Certainly not all domestic violence ends in homicide, and certainly not all relationships that go badly or that break up, people break up all the time, end up in violence. But the ones that I see, the ones that come to my attention, have this component of volatility and emotionality, which as a manager, supervisor, business owner, you've got to get involved with. Why? Because it affects the business. Also, in some states, and some states who listen to me for this discussion here, you may have a mandate that is given by your state legislators that say you will get involved in domestic violence situations that involve your employees because it is the right thing to do. Now, I'll go back to my former state, California. We don't do a lot of things right there, but this is one of the things we did right. We have a hard time apparently keeping the power on and putting out the 1,000 fires we have going on right now. But one thing we do well in California is we have a mandated law in California that says if you're an employee of a business and you come to your boss, manager, supervisor, HR director with a concern about domestic violence, you cannot be fired. Now, this is good things to have, because in the old days we would say, don't bring that crap here, don't bring your personal life here, you're fired. So many organizations would simply get rid of the quote problem or the quote problem employee by terminating this person. Now she has two problems: no job and same bad boyfriend. So same bad ex-husband, same dangerous ex-husband. So in California, we created Senate Bill 400, which says if you're a domestic violence victim and you go to your employer, they must create a safety plan for you at work. They must also create an environment where they respond to this. They don't have to go to the guy's house and talk to him, but they have to create a situation involving security or security guards, or they move the victim to a new facility, put her in a different building, move her from a front counter position to a back of the office type of position, and liaison with law enforcement, liaison with the DA's office, the victim witness advocacy groups, domestic violence hotlines, things like that. In San Diego, one of the best things we ever created in the response to crimes against children and domestic violence victims was the Family Justice Center, run by Casey Gwynn, who we'll talk about in just a second. The Family Justice Center was a creation in San Diego of putting child abuse detectives, domestic violence detectives, domestic violence advocacy groups, child protective services, social workers, therapists together in one building, and creating what we call vertical response or vertical prosecution, which says we're going to take care of these cases. They're not going to fall through the cracks. We're not going to read about this person being killed because we didn't do our jobs. And so the Family Justice Center, and there's one here in Springfield, Missouri as well, is a national model where we have tried to bring all the thought leaders, the experts, the social workers, the therapists, the prosecutors, the police together to say, how do we address this national concern, which is domestic violence? When you look at DV as a workplace issue, you have some advocacy folks inside. You may have a director of human resources, you may have a director of security if you have security as a function in your organization. Certainly department directors, CEO level people can say we can make some changes happen on behalf of this employee. Now, I get it. Many people don't like prying into folks' personal lives, but I always say if it affects the business, then you have a duty to get involved if there's a chance that this person could be injured or killed on your property. Why do we know that? Because the lawsuits created by plaintiffs' attorneys have always said, what was your response once this person's threatening behavior came to the attention of trying to harm my client? What was your response once you found out about this person's threatening emails, phone calls, visits, etc.? In days of old, before, especially in California, you think about before the passage of Senate Bill 400, we would say, don't bring your personal life here, just do your job. We don't want to get involved in all this stuff. And we did that at our own peril, and oftentimes people lost their lives because we didn't read the obvious warning signs of danger to this person's life or to their health. Now what we see is we can have some creativity about how we send the victim home on leave. We put them in a safer location. We move them to another facility. We have them work from home, or we put them in another part of the business where they can work safely and can be monitored. And also, we pay attention to the value and the efficacy of restraining orders. Let's talk about restraining orders for a second. It is a piece of paper. It is not a bulletproof shield. The idea of a restraining order says this is a civil piece of paper which is issued by a judge that says don't come to this facility, this workplace, or don't bother this victim at home, over the phone, face-to-face, by email, by text, by telephone, by any way. Now, it is not a bulletproof shield for the victim, but it does give the organization, if it's a domestic violence situation where the employee works, and guess what? 85% of domestic violence victims work. Most of the time, the perpetrator is going to come to the workplace to try to harm them or threaten them or try to reconcile or whatever it is they try to do because they know the person's going to be there. The idea of the victim being safe or not so safe at work really depends on what the organization's response was. The perpetrators come to the workplace because the victim has moved or changed her telephone number or changed her email and is no longer in contact with the perpetrator. So this guy says, well, the only place I know where she's going to be is she doesn't live in the house or apartment anymore, is at work, and that's where they come to bother this person. And I guess back in my time, 25, 30 years ago when I first got involved in this subject, there maybe was a more of a boundary in the workplace where perpetrators didn't show up there because they were fearful of the consequences. Now they don't care. They barge right into the lobby, they barge right into the hotel, hospital, bank, wherever it is that the victim works, and they threaten the victim in front of everybody. In those situations, the restraining order is not a perfect bulletproof shield, but it is a way to enforce consequences. And we talked in the beginning of this discussion here that arresting the perpetrator in front of his children, arresting the perpetrator for even the smallest physical injury to the victim is all about consequences. We're trying to do something called break the cycle, and I'll talk about what that is. It's connected to Lenore Walker's cycle of domestic violence. So the victim in a workplace situation is encouraged sometimes by the employer to get a restraining order. Now, that doesn't remove the domestic violence possibility, but it simply says there is now another step or an obstacle in place for the perpetrator to have to overcome in order to harm this victim. And what the restraining order does is gives the police the opportunity to arrest this person for just being on the premises, just making a phone call. So the way the restraining order works is that the victim goes to court, and oftentimes they can represent themselves or they can get help from legal aid or a pro bono lawyer that may do this thing on their behalf. It doesn't necessarily have to be a family lawyer, but they can get any attorney or represent themselves. They make a petition to the judge as to why they need a restraining order. This person has bothered me through threats, telephone visits to my employer, visits to my house, threatened my children, threatened my pets, which is a big thing, harming my property, keyed my car, vandalized my house, vandalized my property, threatened me face-to-face, threatened me electronically, threatened me through other kinds of means. And typically in those situations, the judge is going to want to see proof. Here's copies of letters, here's copies of emails, here's copies of texts that I have taken, screenshots of to show the judge what's going on in this situation. And the reason for the restraining order is, and this is a careful legal definition here, is I'm in fear for my life. If the guy is just a jerk and I'm not afraid of him, the judge is not going to issue a restraining order. But if you say I'm fearful for my life, the safety of my children, the safety of my life, of my parents, my pets, then the judge is more likely to issue a restraining order. Now, in many of these situations where the judge makes the ruling, the victim has a chance to speak, and the perpetrator, alleged or convicted or whatever it happens to be, the person who's made these threats has a chance to speak as well. Now, you can imagine that not every time does the perpetrator show up at the restraining order hearing to tell his side, but if he does, he can tell his side, and the judge will make a ruling as to whether or not they need a restraining order between the two. The restraining order then, in those cases, if the perpetrator does not show up, then the judge issues it automatically for as long as the criteria is in place for the victim. And the restraining order says this person has to stay 300 feet away physically from this person and also not contact them by any means electronically. Face-to-face, over the telephone, email, text, a rock tied to a note thrown through their window, any kind of contact whatsoever, that's a violation of the order. Now, the violation of the restraining order is a misdemeanor. And so what happens is the police can show up where this person has made the request for a report and say, this person has violated the order, and the police will look for this person for up to 48 hours after the violation of the order to try to arrest him. Now, when I teach patrol cops all about this stuff, I tell them pay attention to driving to the facility or driving to the victim's house and look for the perpetrator sitting in his car waiting for you to leave before he goes back to confront her again. Try to catch this guy in the act of being a jerk and arrest him for the misdemeanor or the restraining order violation. Now, you can guess that there's lots of ways this can go badly. One is the police do their job, which is they show up and try to make the arrest and they write the misdemeanor restraining order violation report. But the other is the victim screws it up by not calling. And I say this to victims all the time. If this person violates the order, call the police. Don't wait to the magic number. And the magic number is oftentimes 10 or something like that. He called me. This is the 18th time he's called me. When we get to 20, I'm going to call the police. That's not how it works. There should be consequences for his behavior from the first time he violates the order. Now, the second problem is sometimes police departments are not staffed enough. We don't have enough patrol cops. We don't have enough detectives. We don't have detectives who are trained in this type of domestic violence, family violence issue. And as a result, they don't show up. They don't make the police report. They don't do what they're supposed to do in terms of trying to find this guy and catch him. So let me give you a scenario. The woman in this situation is working at a company, and she has a restraining order against her ex-husband, ex-boyfriend. And the reason she has it is he's made threats to harm her, threatened their children, threatened her pets, threatened to harm her parents, etc. She has a restraining order. So he calls one day, and she's at work, and she answers the phone, and he says, baby, I love you. And this restraining order business is ridiculous. You shouldn't even have this thing. I've got coffee and donuts. I'm going to meet you in the parking lot on your break. I just want you to come out. We're going to sit in my car. We can sit in your car. I promise I'll be on my best behavior. Let's talk about our relationship. She says, no, I've got a restraining order. You can't do this. You're not supposed to be calling me. And he says, if you say it's okay, I'm going to come out with, I'll bring coffee and donuts. We'll sit in the car. We'll talk like normal human beings. I just want to talk about our relationship. She agrees. She goes out to the parking lot. She gets in her car, his car or her car. One thing leads to another. He threatens her. He tries to harm her. He hurts her, does something like that. Let's say he just threatens her verbally for the ease of this discussion. The police show up. Somebody calls the cops and says, hey, there's a guy out here arguing with his ex-girlfriend, and I know she's got a restraining order against him, so the cops get there. The cops get there and they talk to him and they say, she has a restraining order and it's been served. You have a copy. We looked it up and it's valid. It's not expired. They usually last for up to 3 years. There's emergency protective orders, which are shorter, and some restraining orders are short time, but usually a protective order lasts 3 years. And you're not supposed to be here. And he says, she said it was okay. I just brought the donuts and the coffee and we were just supposed to talk. And so she gave me permission to come over here. What do the police do in that situation? The answer is they arrest him. The judge told him not to be here, not her. The judge was the one who said, this is a civil order that I am telling you not to bother this victim. It doesn't matter what she says. Now, if she wants to go back to court and say, I don't want the restraining order anymore, then she can do that. But in those situations where he says, well, okay, I get King's X because, it's a situation where she's invited me here, that's not how it goes. The judge told him not to. The police make an arrest. So when we look at our advocacy partners for domestic violence in the workplace, it's human resources. And let's face it, 77% of human resources directors in the United States are female. And when I look at the statistics provided by the Society for Human Resource Management, which I belong to, SHRM, most people that work in HR are female. Most of the directors in the United States, the vast majority, 77%, are female. There's much more empathy, and I'm not saying men aren't empathic, but there's much more empathy in these situations with a female HR manager, HR director looking at this situation and trying to figure out some solutions. Now, if you have security as a function in your organization, there are some female security directors, but it's mostly a male position. A lot of ex-cops, a lot of ex-military are in that position. So there can be a good 1-2 combination of empathic, humanistic support from the human resources professional and a rubber meets the road security position, security posture by the security professional. So those two things are really important when it comes to how they address those situations. They create a safety plan for the victim, and we document what we do. God forbid this woman is injured or killed by the perpetrator, we can say in our defense, look, we moved her to a new facility, we helped her get a restraining order, we posted his picture to the access control points, to the reception people, we reminded everybody who came in contact with this person to call the police, etc. And despite those things, the victim was injured or killed, is much better than saying, well, we told her good luck and we hope it works out for you. So we have a protocol that workplaces can put in place that's a combination of human resources response, including referral to employee assistance program, counseling, things like that, referral to domestic violence advocacy groups, which are in many counties, oftentimes connected to the district attorney's office, and a physical security posture, access control, vigilance, paying attention to these things where this perpetrator might show up as a way to save this person's life. So you think about domestic violence as in terms of the scope. I've handled cases involving 13 and 14-year-olds that were in dating relationships and even in junior high school that had a domestic violence component. I've handled domestic violence involving the elderly, people in dating relationships that were living in nursing homes. So age is not a factor, race is not a factor, gender is not a factor, same-sex sexual orientation happens across the board. And it is one of those shadow concerns that sometimes doesn't become clear to us until we see visible injuries on the victim. We see the startle reflex, we see the change in the victim's personality, their work performance, things like that. So if you have a suspicion, and think about this, if you have children that are in dating age, whether it's early high school, college, if you have concerns about their relationships, you need to talk to them about it, and you need to say to them, anything that happens in a situation where you are harmed by this other person, you need to tell me. And it's not your fault. It's never your fault. It's not something you did. It's the other person's fault, but I need to help you, because sometimes the folks that are in these situations are not able to see their own solutions, not able to find their own rescue from these situations. They say things like, maybe it's me, or maybe I need to be different, or if I do more of this or less of that, the situation's going to get better. Well, there's something connected to this, and it's created by Dr. Lenore Walker, and she was out in Colorado. She created the cycle of domestic violence. And the cycle of domestic violence has 3 steps. It's tension, it's violence, and then what's called the remorse or the honeymoon stage. And where Lenore Walker sort of earned her chops was in testifying in the O.J. Simpson trial about the same things that she saw in O.J. Simpson in terms of tension, violence, and remorse. Nicole Brown Simpson predicted her death. She said, if I get killed, it's going to be O.J., and she had photographs in her safe deposit box of the injuries that he committed on her in domestic violence situations many times. LAPD used to go out there and get signed footballs and things like that, and didn't really do their job when it came to responding to the violence in that household, and look at the results. So let's go through the cycle of domestic violence as Lenore Walker created it. There is a tension stage where both parties are worked up or amped up around each other. The victim may be afraid of this person. The perpetrator may be building a sense of violence towards this person. And then at some point, and the tension stage could last for weeks, months, or years. At some point, there is a snap where this person switches over to violence. There's a physical assault. There's this person's grabbed and thrown down or hit or smacked or punched or whatever happens to be. There's sexual violence. There's physical violence. This person is injured. Sometimes in those situations, the victim does not call the police. They don't call the police because they're fearful of the police response. The police are going to come and take away the father of my children, and he's the one who's the breadwinner, and I won't have any money. The police are going to come and injure or kill my boyfriend or husband because, they do that in violent situations. People think that's what the police do. So there's many times in those situations where the victim will rationalize their behavior and say, well, he was drunk, or I must have pushed his buttons, or I shouldn't have said those things, and they make it their fault when it's actually the perpetrator's fault. When the victim does finally call the police and there are consequences for the behavior, the person gets arrested. Sometimes they go to jail and bail this guy out. And it's interesting to me how many times I've seen the police change in their understanding of the situation. They're trying to be the rescuer to this person, and the person who is the victim sees them as the harasser. And so it's a real complex dynamic there where the police are trying to do their job on behalf of saving this person's life, but they don't see it that way. They see it as interfering in their marriage or their dating relationship. So the remorse part is the interesting part of the cycle. It is what the victim feels is sort of honeymoon stage. The perpetrator buys flowers or says, "Baby, I'm really sorry. I'll never do that again. And you have my word. I swear in a stack of Bible. I swear in my mother's grave. I'll never do that again." And during the honeymoon stage or the remorse stage, this person is showered with affection, and the person, the perpetrator is kind to them and emotionally supportive. And the victim says, wow, this is the person I started dating, or this is the person I originally married, and isn't this great how this person is treating me? And yes, I had to get smacked around, and yes, I got my hair pulled, or I got choked or punched or kicked or sexually assaulted, but look at how this person is treating me now. This is the part that I really like. So they rationalize the person's previous attacking, threatening, injurious behavior to get into this remorse honeymoon stage. Now, here's the problem, as you can guess. The remorse stage lasts a very short period of time, and then guess what happens? The tension stage starts all over again. So we see this cycle, and it is a cycle. It is a circular cycle, go over and over and over again. Tension, violence, remorse, tension, violence, remorse. The honeymoon phase is pleasant as it can be because the perpetrator has realized that if he does it again, he's going to go to jail or this person's going to leave him. But then sometimes from the remorse stage to the next set of tension, the perpetrator realizes if this person leaves me, I may have to kill her. If this person tries to leave me, I may have to kill her. So this concept of staying around in these situations has been talked about by cops and people sort of on the outside of the domestic violence issue looking inward and go, well, why would this person stay? If anybody ever hit me, boy, I'd be out of there in 2 seconds. And I would say, okay, well, let's put yourself in the victim's shoes here. Sometimes these perpetrators control the money, they control the credit cards, they control the checking account, they control the housing. This perpetrator creates a sense of fear in the victim of him. This guy's going to harm my kids, my pets. There's a lot of guilt that I have. I'm not supposed to leave my boyfriend or husband. That's not what we do. Some domestic violence situations are connected by cultural pressure, which is in my culture, we don't leave. And my dad hit my mom, and she turned out okay. And it was just one of those things where there's sort of a social proof or a cultural pressure thing, which is, I know this is wrong, but I'm not going to break up my marriage because this is what happens in our culture. There's also a sense of, with the victims, that somehow the perpetrator is going to be magically fixed by some counseling intervention or by going to jail or something like that. It doesn't happen. I used to teach domestic violence response as a advanced officer training component and to new academy recruits in San Diego when I would talk about the domestic violence issue. And I would address a real concern, especially for younger cops, newer cops, that would say, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't she just leave? This guy hits me, and I'd be out of there in 2 seconds. Why didn't you just leave? Well, a couple things. One, it's never that easy, and if she could, she would. So I always do an exercise which really tries to drive home, from my perspective, the why doesn't she just leave problem. So I'll get $40 worth of Monopoly money, tens and fives and ones and all. I usually try to pick the biggest guy in the room, some big burly dude, and then I'll say, okay, young copper or old copper, come over here. Here's $40, okay? I have just abused you physically, sexually, emotionally, and you have left the house. And it is midnight or 1 in the morning. You fled our home in your car. You're wearing sweatpants, and you have a baby, and the baby has, let's say the baby's 10 months old. You have $40. Where are you going to go? You're fearful if you go back home you could be injured or killed by this guy, and you're afraid to call the police, or you have called the police, and the guy's bailed out of jail, and he's come back home, and you've left. And so then the cop will say, well, I'll go to a hotel, and I'll just check in a hotel for the night. And I say, well, you don't have any money. You have $40, and he has the credit cards and checking account. And then the person says, well, then I'll go to a relative. And then I say, all the relatives are fearful of this guy. They don't want you to come over to the house because they're fearful of him showing up drunk and violent, and they don't want that. So you burned all your bridges. Can't go to your mom. She lives in another state. Can't go to your sisters. There's nobody you can go to. None of your friends want this guy showing up. Then you say, well, I only got $40. I guess I can't go to a hotel. What are you going to do? I don't know. I guess I have to sleep in my car. Okay, so you sleep in your car. In the morning, you have a baby. This baby needs formula. This baby needs diapers. And so you go to the drugstore and you buy formula and you buy diapers and you feed your baby. And then you say, well, I need some food myself. So you go to McDonald's and you get a breakfast, at McDonald's. And then you say, I don't have very much gas in my car, and I have to put a little bit of gas in my car, and then you drive around all day. And then you say, well, I guess, do I have to do this again? And so maybe you spend another night in your car, and then the process repeats itself where you have to get diapers and formula, and you have to feed yourself, and pretty soon you're running out of money. And guess what happens? You go back home. You go back home. And so these perpetrators know that this is going to happen because they control the finances, and they get this person to go back home. So whenever some cop or somebody on the outside, some well-meaning person says, why doesn't she just leave? It misses the entire difficulty of how hard it is to leave. That's why we work so hard in domestic violence advocacy and social work and support and family justice center and police investigators and detectives who are trained in this model to get them out of the cycle, to get them out of their house, to get them into safe housing, to get them into shelters. I mean, think about this as the United States here. There are more animal shelters in the United States than there are shelters for battered women. I mean, that's something wrong there. There are more animal shelters, and I love my dogs and cats, but there are more animal shelters in the United States than there are shelters for battered women. And oftentimes, you know, if we go back to my $40 Monopoly money story, the cops say, well, why doesn't you just go to a shelter? Guess what? They're full. They're full. Or they don't take children sometimes, or they don't take pets, and the person is left with their dog or their cat or something like that. They don't take pets. When you look at this subject taken to an extreme, there is a connection here I want to make back to my friends Gail Strack and Casey Gwynn, and they run the San Diego-based Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And this program that they run is a training center for law enforcement and for prosecutors. It's part of their Alliance for Hope International, which was created in October 2011 to provide training and technical assistance to police and prosecutors and medical clinicians and domestic violence advocates about choking violence in domestic violence. So if you go to their website, and it's strangulationtraininginstitute.com, you can see some of the scary statistics, and they're chilling, about how strangulation is part of domestic violence situations that typically end up in death for the victim. So 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetimes, and women in high risk, up to 68% will experience near fatal strangulation by their partners. Loss of consciousness can occur within 5 to 10 minutes and death within minutes after that. 97% of victims are strangled with somebody's hands. They report losing consciousness at about 40%. 35% are strangled during sexual assault or sexual abuse. 10% are pregnant. 70% of the strangled victims believe that they were going to die. Now, here's the statistics that really sort of terrifying me. So when you see these cases where the victim was choked, and we say this to cops and to prosecutors, like being a little bit pregnant, you can't just be choked a little bit and not have serious, significant, permanent, or even fatal damage to their throats, their breathing, or to their brains. Brain cell death from choking is rapid and oftentimes fatal. Now, here's the statistic that's so terrifying. Odds for a homicide increase 750% for victims who have been previously strangled compared to domestic violence who have never been strangled. So, as a risk factor, and the cops look at this, and social workers look at this, and domestic violence advocates look at this, if your partner, your ex-boyfriend, ex-husband, whoever it was, that you were in cohabitation or had a child together, if this person has choked you previously, you have a 750% chance of being killed by this person than compared to people who have not. Only half the victims have visible injuries, and only 15% of these can be photographed. There's the biggest one that shows up is typically bruising around the throat, but that may not show up in the first initial hours after the police get there. Those photographs typically come in the next couple of days. Choking causes damage to the victim's throat. Breathing, swallowing, coughing, talking is difficult. And then typically we see probably the most common thing, which are petechial spots, show up on the victim's face, scalp, mouth, earlobes, and the eyeballs. There is a broken blood vessel which shows up in the person's eyeballs when they are choked, and that's the one that typically the police see when they go out there. So death can occur weeks or days after the attack due to carotid artery dissection and respiratory complications connected to pneumonia and difficulty breathing, including blood clots. So imagine what it feels like to be choked. The psychological injuries are depression, suicidal ideations, memory problems, nightmares, anxiety, stress, amnesia, and even psychosis. So what do we do? Employers need to tell their employees, if you're in a domestic violence relationship, get help from the police and other qualified social services professionals. You can use our employee assistance program. You can go to community advocacy groups who specialize in domestic violence response. There are shelters. There are domestic violence advocacy groups connected to the district attorney's office, and you can get a plan to protect yourself, your children, your pets, and to save your life. If you're in a domestic violence situation where you have been previously choked, the need for you to get out should be dramatically displayed by the statistics I just talked about. In the United States, we have the National Domestic Violence Victim Hotline, 800-799-7233. The National Domestic Violence Hotline in the United States, 800-799-7233 or 800-799-SAFE. Let's change tracks. Time to talk about Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week. One of my favorite parts of the show. It's Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week. Here's where I get to talk about some of our dumbest criminals who managed to get themselves arrested based on their monumental stupidity. Okay, Dateline. This is Louisa, Virginia. A pair of melon heads, yes, actual people with watermelons that they had carved out and put on their heads, caused quite a stir after they used the watermelons as face masks to allegedly steal from a convenience store in Louisa, Virginia. The duo pulled up in a 2006 black Toyota Tacoma pickup truck and entered a Sheetz store on May 5th while wearing carved-out watermelons with holes cut out for their eyes, according to the police department. One of the two suspects was arrested. Right afterwards, they're looking for the second suspect. The first suspect that was arrested has been charged with wearing a mask in public while committing larceny, underage possession of alcohol. I know it shocks you that alcohol is involved there, and petty theft of alcohol. So the old watermelon heads trying to do a little liquor store ripoff there. Let's test your Crime Time IQ with this week's crime quiz question. Who is the oldest gun maker in the world? And what country, bonus question here, what country is the oldest gun maker in the world from? Okay, so if you are a fan of shotguns and handguns, think about Beretta. Founded in the 16th century, Beretta, and they're based in Italy, is the oldest active manufacturer of firearms and firearm components in the world. In 1526, think about that. In 1526, its inaugural product was called an arquebus barrel. It was a long-barreled gun called a matchlock firearm that was one of its earliest rifles. It shot a musket ball. Beretta made barrels equipped the Venetian fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So Beretta, oldest shotgun and handgun maker in the world, started in the middle 1500s. Amazing, eh? Crime Time safety tip. Speaking of firearms, this week's Crime Time safety tip is about firearms safety. This is a reminder to keep all handguns, shotguns, and rifles locked up using gun safes or trigger locks. It's not enough to keep your guns unloaded, as some people say they will do. Kids can still get access to ammunition. If they have access to an unloaded firearm and a box of ammo, you can do the math there about the tragedy that may happen. Guns can still get stolen or worse, used by a child against another child accidentally or on purpose. We've seen suicidality with kids using firearms that they found at home. If you think about domestic violence, mass shootings with school kids, most of these kids get their guns from home, and most of them steal their guns from home. If you're a 15-year-old kid and you shoot up the high school, the gun you get is the one that you had at home. So people say, well, I live alone. I can leave my gun on the nightstand, or I can leave my gun somewhere else and in the house, and I live alone. But I would say if anyone ever comes to visit you, relatives or family members who have kids, or people that you hire to clean or work in or around your house, even then you've got to store your guns safely to prevent them from being stolen or used in a dangerous way. So we have trigger locks, and those are oftentimes used by key, or they have digital trigger locks. We also have combination locks on them. I like a gun safe. I have a small one and a big one in my house, and I have a closet that it's got a steel door, and I can lock it from the outside with a sturdy lock, and the hinges can't be taken off. So I have a gun safe in there, which is electronic, and you put in the numbers, and it pops right up. So think about kids involved in stealing guns from home. I've heard lots of parents say, my kid knows not to go under my bed and find that box that's marked Glock. He's not supposed to go in there. My kid knows not to dig through my sock drawer where I keep my guns and my bullets. That's the stupid stuff that we hear, and then there's a tragedy. In one of the most famous cases of a mass attack on an elementary school, Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut, the shooter was given an assault rifle by his mother, and guess where the gun safe was that had the assault weapon? It was in his bedroom. Not what we want to do. So get a small safe for your handguns and a larger safe if you have rifles and shotguns, and keep them locked. Keep your ammo locked up too, especially these days. It's in short supply. Pretty tough to get ammunition these days. The gun range I go to, I was just at last week, they're selling ammunition when you come in, but it's expensive. It's a popular thing for burglars to steal. So get a safe with a digital combination lock, or you can open it quickly in an emergency when you really need your firearm. Other than that, keep it stored away and locked. You don't want a gun-related tragedy on your conscience for the rest of your life. So thanks for listening to this episode of Crime Time. I encourage you to go to my website at crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email with questions or topics that you want me to cover on future shows. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's at Dr. Steve Albrecht, Albrecht. Follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. I like Twitter a lot. I get stuck sometimes in the Twitter rabbit holes, but it's fast. There's a lot of information that's captured in a short period of time, and I like the connection to the rest of the world. I just have to be careful that I don't spend all day on Twitter. In our world, there are sheep and shepherds and wolves. Too many people are sheep and too few people are shepherds. There are lots of wolves out there. There are not enough police officers or sheriff's deputies or state troopers to protect us all. You need to be a shepherd. Take care of yourself and protect your family and your loved ones and your friends and your coworkers. Pay attention at home, at school, at work. Be prepared to defend yourself with legal force if necessary. Be a good witness for the police if you see a crime. Stay safe and aware and alert at home, at school, at work, and even on the road. Thanks for listening to Crime Time. Thanks to Jim Whining, producer Matt, and all the good folks at Acts Media Group. I'm Steve Albrecht, and thanks for listening to What I Know is Right.